Hello, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nazrin Alia binti Muhammad Zubair, 2019-723-081. My research title today will be Comparison of Motivation on Physical Activity Participation between Types of Sports among FSR Students. Chapter 1, Introduction. For background of study, individual participation can differ by recommending divergence of motivation for physical activity participation by BICE 2016. Secondly, motivation encourage athletes to continue in sports participation remain important in modern sport. And thirdly, motivation not only impacts engagement in physical activity, but it is also a key factor in adherence to exercise. Statement of problem. Firstly, participants in sports events are motivated differently than participants in daily sports and recreational activities by Moradi 2020. There is also limited study on other types of sports than individual sports and team sports on their motivation in physical activity participation. This study will be focusing on following research objectives. Firstly is to measure motivation on physical activity participation of subjects. Second is to identify motives toward physical activity participation in different types of sports. And lastly is comparison of motivation on physical activity participation between types of sports among FSR students. As for the significance of study, this study will be beneficial for coaches, researchers, psychologists, sports players, parents, and students themselves. As for literature review, firstly is motivation. Intrinsic motivation that comes from a player's love of the sport gives chance for them to improve their self-motivation and extend their overall success by Herald 2019. And as for physical activity participation, participants who use exercise and recreational activities as their main form of physical activities are motivated by more extrinsic builds than the one who do sports as main form of physical activities by Ball, Bice, and Perry. As for athletes' motivation, these researchers states that team sports participation may be powerfully linked to positive social and psychological results compared to individual sports. And lastly, for the types of sports, the biggest differentiator was team sports affiliation, individual racing sports plus bowling participants' enjoyment, racket sports dominance, exercises psychological state, and lastly martial arts players competition or ego. Chapter 3, Methodology. For research design, I'll be using quantitative analysis, which I had obtained numerical data, and I also apply causal comparative research design using surveys. As for sampling, my participants or respondents consist of students from Faculty of Sport Science and Recreation from UiTM Seremban. From the total of 786 students, I had selected minimum of 254 students by referring to Craigie and Morgan 90-70 table. For sampling technique, I use simple random sampling as it is easy to use and accurate depiction of larger population stated by OGB and Wahab in 2017. I had also gained access to the total amount of FSR students and their personal information such as phone number, which I had randomly picked according to required amount of subjects. As for the inclusion of criteria will be either male or female. Secondly is subject age starting from 18 years old. And thirdly is participants must focus on identifying their motivation. As for exclusion criteria, firstly is subjects engaging with drugs or alcohol. Secondly is subjects below 18 years old. Third is participants from another faculty, and lastly is subjects have depression or anxiety. For instrumentation, I use questionnaire, which is Physical Activity and Leisure Motivation Scale (PALMS) by Tony Morris and Helen Rogers in 2004, with subfactors of mastery, enjoyment, psychological condition, physical condition, appearance, others' expectation, affiliation, and competition or ego, with 0.79 Cronbach Alpha by Roy Chowdhury 2018 of 40 number of items and 5-point Likert scale questions. Data collection procedure starts with first ethical approval, then seek permission to conduct research study, Third is provide brief explanation of study and distribute the questionnaire to selected subjects. Fourth, collect questionnaire and computerize the data. And lastly, data analysis and interpretation. As for statistical analysis, I use descriptive analysis to measure motivation on physical activity participation between types of sports. And I use one-way ANOVA to identify motives towards physical activity participation in different types of sports, as well as to compare the motivation on physical activity participation between types of sports among FSR students. Chapter 4. Findings and Analysis. These are the results. For the objective of to measure the motivation of physical activity participation of subjects, physical condition with mean of 23.1811 is the top rated motivating factor, while others' expectation with mean of 16.5354 is the lowest rated motivating factor. For one-way ANOVA analysis, firstly is physical condition. Based on the results, there is no significant difference of motivation of physical condition for all types of sports, as p-value is equal to 0.361, more than 0.05 significance value. And as for enjoyment, there is no significant difference of motivation in enjoyment between groups, as p-value is 0.471, more than 0.05 significance value. As for the next results, there is no significant difference of motivation in mastery between groups, as p-value is equal to 0.240, more than 0.05. And in psychological condition, there is also no significant difference between groups, as p-value is equal to 0.457. Next is affiliation, as there is no significant difference of motivation between groups, as p-value is equal to 0.543, more than 0.05. And for appearance, there is also no significant difference of motivation, as the p-value is equal to 0.134, more than 0.05. With the same results of no significant difference of motivation is others' expectation, as p-value is equal to 0.281, more than 0.05. Nonetheless, with p-value of 0.005 less than significance value 0.05, the result is significance between group of their motivation in competition or ego. For competition or ego subscale, we undergo post hoc analysis Bonferroni, and the results is motivation of competition or ego were significant between team sports and racket sport, where p-value is equal to 0.020 less than 0.05. Then competition or ego motivation for racket sports and martial arts were significant, as p-value is equal to 0.030.
Chapter 5. Discussion. Physical condition motivation between types of sports does not differ, as they all have the same drive in order to participate in physical activity. Internal physical activity motivations leads to the formation of sense of duty, and to physical activity will improve physical health metrics. Kolomitseva 2020. Also, every participating student in sports is high in enjoyment in physical activity, as it is associated with overall interest. Otundo and McGregor. Motives of mastery in physical activity participation is equal between types of sports, as every student learns to get better at an activity as sports background students, and those that foster positive self-perceptions and subsequent physical activity provide inclusive mastery-oriented environment by Keep 2017.
Psychological condition motives are equal between types of sport, as they are in the same level of sports performance. Ardenska 2019 estimates the level of motivation for psychological condition with precise regard to the field of sports and level of participation. Others' expectation motives is equal but low in mean between different types of sports. Individual and community social needs are met, and this function to provide income for professionals. affiliation motives are high between groups to develop social skills in physical activity participation or sports. In construction of affiliation and pleasure motives, sports activity may be highly important by Wallhead 2013. Every types of sports athletes aim for appearance motives while participating in physical activities. Individuals report more external motivation for exercise such as weight loss and improvement in appearance, which reflect more regulated sources of motivation by Otundo and McGregor 2019. Competition or ego motivation shows significant difference between types of sports. Athletes fear being injured and losing fights, and they need to demonstrate masculinity to counter this fear. Also, racket sports were examined among more competitive players and had replaced mastery as primary motives for participation. These are the reference. Million thanks to the panel for taking the time to listen to my research proposal. And with that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.